we might live and breathe together the gospel of Jesus Christ. Amen. So good morning, everyone. So we're starting on a new fall series this week that is going to have a couple of different parts. It's not going to be every week. It's going to be a recurring series over the next 2 months. And we're starting today with the theme of science and faith in tension. You'll recall that last week we talked about managing tension in 2020. So we're continuing this week with the theme of tension a little bit. You'll notice the handout that we gave to you. A couple of disclaimers before we get into this. You'll notice that handout says summer 2011. A lot of the information that we have and some of the research that'll be done for this sermon series will be taken from a previous series that was done at Kalamazoo First United Methodist back in 2011. That's why the year is on there. You'll also see my dad's name on that handout if you read through it. So that's the first disclaimer. Another couple of disclaimers. I've had a tendency in the past to be kind of intellectual and professorial when I get into this stuff, and I know that is not the favorite mode of preaching for many of you. So I will do my best not to get too much into that mode during this series, and I apologize in advance if I do at any point. It's because I enjoy talking about these things. Later on, after this opening week, we're going to have 3 two-part series that are a part of this longer series. The first 2-part series is going to be God as creator of heaven and earth. The second part will look a little more in depth at some of the ideas that are laid out on the handout that you have. Ideas like evolution and creationism and intelligent design. That'll be a 2-part series. And the third and final 2-part series that will follow today will be a series about seeing faith and science in harmony with one another. So as you can see, we're beginning with the tension, and we're going to end later in November with the harmony of science and faith. So the insert, or rather the handout that we gave you, is called the Map of Divine Action. It's a basic continuum, and it's one way to make sense of some of the ideas that we're going to explore. I'd also like to note that as best as possible, these ideas are presented without judgment. I'm aware that I have my own biases, and we all have our own individual biases, but we're going to do the best we can to examine these as ideas and not as political stances or anything like that. So in this handout, the level of God's activity goes from the left side, where God is understood to actively intervene in earthly matters, to the far right side, where there is no belief in any type of God, in other words, atheism. My guess is that most of us in this sanctuary are somewhere in the middle of this spectrum, that we don't have too many people on either extreme. Right in the middle of that continuum is something called theistic evolution. This is generally where the United Methodist Church resides, and I also encourage you all, if you get a chance, to take a look at our social principles, which are in the pews, for some of our stances on particular scientific issues. The middle of this spectrum is one of the places where we can try to find science and faith in harmony. It's a place that is faithful to the Creator God and to the Christian faith. It is an intellectually honest place to be in, both in terms of the glorious activity of God in the world and of the work of science in the world. And so we offer this as a way to have some concrete material to build on going forward. The extremes, we talked about balance in our children's message. Balance will be an ongoing theme in this series. Because the extremes of this continuum can be problematic. They can be problematic for our individual life and for our community. The extreme on the right would be the place where science reigns supreme as a materialistic pursuit with no spiritual or supernatural work of any kind involved, where science trumps all religious faith. It would see reality only as a set of observable data that can be determined empirically. It would be the position that sees faith as perhaps primitive or unverifiable. The problem here, of course, being that when science tries to trump faith, there is no recognition of a spiritual world, which I think we would all agree is a huge, huge problem, being that we're here together this morning. There's no accounting for mystery. There's no accounting for miracle. And there's also no grounding in a morality beyond that of the scientific process, which is morally neutral and can be abused. So at the extreme of this position, you might find someone like Richard Dawkins, the famed Oxford biologist. He also is, I believe, a self-proclaimed atheist as well. So that's one extreme. The other extreme, the extreme on the left side of the handout, would be the place where faith always trumps science. And we have a position that does not have a place for the pursuit of science within God's creation. It would not provide room for science to be a mode of thinking that follows God's mode of thinking. At its worst, that position on the spectrum would have no choice but to undercut the scientific process itself and to cut off from pursuing a real understanding of God's creation of the physical world. So on both ends of this continuum, we find ourselves denying certain truths and depriving ourselves of the truths that we can discover in the middle. We, as United Methodists, we affirm both faith and science, and we live our lives and we offer the world up in a harmony that is critical to solving this sort of balance of worldviews. At the end of today's message, we're going to conclude with a quote from Francis Collins. Perhaps some of you have heard of him. He is a University of Michigan geneticist in the past who discovered, and this is why he has personal significance to our family, he discovered the defective gene for cystic fibrosis and then went on to found the Human Genome Project. Francis Collins is an accomplished scientist and is also a devout Christian. So he resides in the middle here too, along with much of the United Methodist Church. And we're going to hear from him at the end of our message. So taking a look at the position in the middle of our handout today, this theistic evolution, there's another name beneath it that you see could also be called biologos, bio standing for life, and logos standing for the wisdom and truth of God at the center of the universe. So what can this position offer us? Well, I'll give you a list of things. The first thing it does, number one, is that it recognizes the reality of a creator. It recognizes there is a wisdom and an intelligence in the universe that called life into being. It recognizes that there are organizing principles for how that life has evolved. This is very much unlike the atheism at the right end of the scale. It's also unlike creationism on the other end because it does not bind itself to the literal reading of Genesis chapters 1 and 2. But rather it sees the Bible as a much more beautiful and multi-layered account of God and God's logos. The second thing that it does is it does acknowledge the validity and integrity of the scientific method. We follow that method in our society, but we also worship a God in church who has set up the principles of that method. And that method has determined so much of the future of humanity that its integrity is extremely important, as is the importance of the moral code that we believe God has given to us to live in the world. So it allows room for both. Third, this biologos, or theistic evolution method, leaves room for mystery. It acknowledges that there is a whole spiritual or mystical realm out there that is beyond science. It recognizes that the scientific method cannot explain faith, hope, joy, love, all the best things in life. Unlike the other items on other parts of this scale, it does not reduce everything to empirical evidence. Number 4, it recognizes how such a universe could be so finely tuned for human life. The physical constants that we have, the laws of nature, the 4 different kinds of interactions, gravitation, electromagnetic, strong and weak nuclear, all point to a universe that makes our life possible. Number 5, the 5th thing it does is to recognize the idea of evolution as a valid scientific theory. It affirms that it is a part of God's wisdom, which allowed for the unfolding of all of life in its beauty and its splendor. Unlike deism or a couple of the ideas to the right on this scale, might say that God formed everything at the beginning and then sort of went on vacation and just left it alone. It is not like that. It says it's open to the reality that God can work as a part of this evolutionary process, that the Holy Spirit, part of our Trinity, is present and active. Unlike some of the other items to the left side of the scale, that might say that nature and evolution don't have a built-in capacity to produce life on their own, but require new godly acts of creation, Biologos would say that God got it right the first time, and evolution and nature have the ability to produce complex forms of life. Number 6, the 6th thing that this does is recognize that there is a special place and time for human beings in the world, and that place and time is right here and right now. It recognizes that we, who Christians understand as being made in the image of God, have special gifts not yet possessed by other species on earth, like the gift of vocation, the gifts of moral awareness, the gifts of relationship, the gifts of sexuality, the gifts of blessings of living in community and fellowship with one another. All these things. The 7th thing that it does, and this is one of the last things we'll look at today, against some of the other positions on the scale, is it establishes that there is a moral imperative in the world as we know it. So Francis Collins also notes that human beings everywhere are drawn to an understanding of right and wrong. They are drawn to a higher and holier calling. Now we can mess that calling up a lot, and we have. But that calling can only be understood as the grace of God working in the world and within us. And we further understand it in our tradition as prevenient and justifying and sanctifying grace. So this balance, this middle road that we are attempting to walk here, it allows faith to be faith, and it allows science to be science. It allows both realms to be independent but interrelated. And it places critical importance on each of their strengths and purposes, all of which is within the realm of the grace of God. It is the place where we will attempt to find that harmony between science and faith. And we're going to conclude today with a quote from Francis Collins about finding that harmony. In the 21st century, in an increasing technological society, a battle is raging for the hearts and minds of humanity. Many materialists, noting triumphantly the advances of science in filling in the gaps of our understanding of nature, announce that belief in God is an outmoded superstition, and that we would be better off admitting that and moving on. Many believers in God, convinced that the truth they derive from spiritual introspection is of more enduring value than truths from other sources, see the advances in science and technology as dangerous and untrustworthy. Positions are hardening. Voices are becoming more shrill. Will we turn our backs on science because it is perceived as a threat to God? abandoning all of the promise of advancing our understanding of nature and applying that to the alleviation of suffering and the betterment of the world? Alternatively, will we turn our backs on faith, concluding that science has rendered the spiritual life no longer necessary, and that traditional religious symbols can now be replaced by engravings of scientific symbols like the double helix? Both of these choices are profoundly dangerous. Both deny truth. Both will diminish the nobility of humankind. Both will be devastating for our future. And both are unnecessary. The God of the Bible is also the God of the genome. God can be worshipped in the cathedral or in the laboratory or in the home. God's creation is majestic, awesome, intricate, and beautiful. And it cannot be at war with itself. Only we imperfect humans can start such battles, and only we can end them. Thanks be to God.